May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. A lighthearted story by way of introduction. An old man in Arizona calls up his son in New York City a couple days before Thanksgiving. And he says to his son, "I'm very sorry to ruin your day, but I need to tell you that your mother and I are getting divorced. After 45 years of misery, we've decided we've had enough." His son is dumbfounded, doesn't know what to say, and asks his father what's going on. He says, "I don't know what to tell you. We're sick of each other. We're sick of looking at each other. I'm sick of talking about this. You need to call your sister in Chicago and tell her the news." His son frantically calls his sister in Chicago, tells her that their parents are getting divorced. His sister explodes. "Like fun, they're getting divorced. Hang up, I'm going to call them, I'm going to fix this." She calls her father in Phoenix, and she says, "You are not getting divorced. I don't know what's going on down there, but you just stay right there. I'm going to be home tomorrow. I'm going to call my brother, tell him to be home tomorrow. We're going to work this out. Don't do anything until we get there." She slams the phone down. Her father turns to her mother sitting on the couch next to him and says, "Well, they're coming home for Thanksgiving, and they're paying their own way." In this story from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is trying to shock his disciples into paying attention to the world in a different way. To look at the world through God's eyes. To pay attention to what's really important, to pay attention to what's going on around them. He's talking about the end times, and he says it's like the flood. Back in Moses' day, people were going along about their business, planting crops and eating and drinking and getting married and having families. And then one day it started to rain, and it never stopped, and everything was swept away. Jesus says the end times will be like that. Two people will be working in a field. One of them will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be working, grinding wheat. One will be taken and one will be left. Jesus says the day of the Lord, the end times, is like the thief in the night. If the housekeeper had known what time the thief was coming, he would have been awake and ready for the thief. But the end times come at a time that no one knows. Jesus says nobody knows what time they're coming. The angels in heaven don't know what time the end times are coming. Jesus himself doesn't know when the end times are coming. Only God knows when the end times are coming. Therefore, Jesus says, keep awake, be alert. Now, our Christian tradition has struggled over the centuries about what to make of this passage and others like it in the Bible. One thread of interpretation says that what Jesus is describing is an actual historical event that's going to happen sometime in the future. Jesus will return. Jesus will sit in judgment. Some of us will be judged worthy to be raised into glory, and others of us will be left to endure God's wrath. The early Christians thought that that day was coming soon, within their lifetime. And they were very confused when it didn't happen. But still, we have Christians today who are waiting for that event to happen, for the end times to come, for Jesus to return, and to sit in judgment on all humankind. One thread of interpretation. A second way of looking at this story suggests that actually it's not a future historical event, but it's an event that all of us go through at the time of our death. After you and I draw our last breath, we will stand before God on the judgment seat, and we'll have to give an accounting for our lives. Where we stayed on the path and where we missed the mark. And we will be weighed in the balance. Some of us will be found wanting, and others will be found deserving of heaven. And none of us knows when the hour of our death is coming, and so the invitation of this passage is to be ready to be judged, to be ready for that day of reckoning. The third interpretation of this suggests that actually Jesus' language is metaphorical, it's symbolic. And actually, we all stand in judgment every day. Every day is an opportunity to live the life that God has invited us to live. Every day is an opportunity to fall off the path and mess things up. The invitation is to live every day as if it is our last. Now, I don't know about you, none of this sounds like terribly good festive holiday news to me. Of course, we've just enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner with family and friends, probably a little shopping, maybe some decorating for Christmas, getting ready for a month of parties and other festivities. And then we walk into the church to hear the sobering message of keep awake, keep alert. You do not know when the end is coming. So I want to offer three pretty quirky, individual to me, responses about what I think this passage may be saying to me this December 1st, 2019. Maybe some of this resonates for you and maybe it doesn't, but maybe it gets you to think about what this idea of the end times, what this idea of someday in some way being judged may be talking to you, may be speaking to your life today. First, yesterday I had a conversation on the phone with a colleague of mine from Rochester, another Episcopal priest, and he mentioned he was on his way to a meeting with other Episcopal churches in Rochester to talk about their work at School 9. And it took me back. When I first moved to Rochester in the early 90s and was working for an Episcopal church, we were involved at that time with a consortium of Episcopal churches doing all sorts of work at School 9. School 9 is in the inner city of Rochester, a very poor neighborhood, very challenging conditions, and we were doing tutoring in classrooms, providing teacher aides, we're collecting school supplies, doing weekend feeding programs. We ran an after-school program because the school couldn't afford to do after-hours care, but we also knew that the kids were going home to empty houses, so we were providing after-school care and tutoring for them in a building near the school. These Episcopal churches, when I got to Rochester in the early 90s, had already been engaged in this ministry for over a decade. And it was a really impressive ministry. It's really great work. And it has continued all those years since, and they're still looking at ways to be helpful in that school. And that is admirable. It's great. And I applaud the efforts of those churches and all the people who've been, the hundreds of people who've been involved in that work over the years. But for whatever reason, what bubbled up for me yesterday was the flip side of that, which is that School 9 is no better off today than it was when this ministry started in the 80s. The conditions there are still awful. There is still no money to provide adequate teaching, adequate education for those children. The neighborhood is as poor as it was, if not worse off. The situation is just as dire. The expected outcomes for the students who go to School 9 is just as negative as it was 30, 40 years ago. And so the conversation Rob and I had on the phone was, wouldn't it be interesting, instead of figuring out how to do this kind of band-aid, stopgap measure work that the church has done for all these decades, which is important work, good work, if we put our heads together and figured out if there's anything we can do to resolve the underlying problems. Very difficult, intractable, incredibly difficult problems, the socioeconomic situation that School 9 finds itself in. Is there any way to solve that problem so that long-term outcomes would improve? Sometimes I think God may be calling us to a different, more difficult, unexpected kind of work than what we are used to doing. Certainly providing the aid that people need in the here and now is important. But looking at the underlying issues that lead to that need is also important. And we can't let the one distract us from the important task of the other. God may be calling us, you and me, and the church, to think about the work that we do in a different way and how to be helpful to those around us. One thing that bubbled up for me as I studied this lesson. Second, I was very happy to have the opportunity to fly to my parents' house in Indiana this week and spend some time with them. My dad had back surgery a couple of weeks ago. It's been a slow recovery. He's doing okay. My mom has been sort of around the bend dealing with taking care of him at home. They had thought that maybe he'd go to rehab, that because of insurance these days that didn't happen, and so she had a lot more at home to deal with than she expected to. Originally, the plan had been for my sisters and my 4 nephews to come join us for Thanksgiving Day, but as the week progressed, it became very clear to all 3 of us that that just really wasn't a great idea. My dad wasn't really in great shape to do that. My mom was around the bed with everything that was going on, and I wasn't quite ready for the zoo of keeping all that together either. And so it was depressing calling my sisters and sort of telling them the situation and asking them not to come. I was looking forward to seeing my nephews, and that was a loss. But the day of Thanksgiving arrived. My mom decided that rather than cook anything, that we would get takeout from Bob Evans. I was also not real keen on that because I could certainly cook, but she didn't want the mess and all that business, and so that's what we did. It ended up middle afternoon. It was quiet. It was a lovely meal. We had an easy conversation. We didn't have a house full of screaming people and kids all over. We didn't have the annual meltdown in the kitchen over getting the meal on the table. It really was a lovely time with my parents. Missing my sisters, missing my nephews. I'll see them at some point in the coming months. But it was the right thing for those three people this year. I relay all of that because I know the stress that all of us go through trying to figure out how to do the holiday in the right way. How the table needs to be set, the right foods that need to be prepared, all the people that need to be invited, the presents that need to be bought, the decorations that need to be put up. And I wonder sometimes if we can't give ourselves a break and we won't find us on the other side of that we're just as happy, if not happier. That our celebrations have been actually more life-giving, even though they didn't include all the things we thought were essential. If you are looking at the coming Christmas holiday with a sort of dread, and there are things that maybe you're thinking you could do without, an invitation to experiment this year and do without them, and see in January how you feel and what your experience of Christmas was. A second example where God may be calling us to look at what is essential, look at what is really important, and what we have larded on to all those essential things that actually get in the way. Finally, this image of God entering the end times, coming in like the thief in the night, when no one expects them, in the quiet of the night, reminds me that God often speaks to us in silence, in unexpected moments of silence. I think about the story of Elijah. You remember Elijah sitting on the mountainside waiting to see God. And there's a great windstorm that comes, splits the mountain, splits rocks in two, but God was not in the wind. And then there's an earthquake, a mighty earthquake that shakes the ground, but God was not in the earthquake. And then a raging fire, but God was not in the fire. And finally, the sound of sheer silence. And in that silence, Elijah has an experience of God, the living God. There are opportunities in moments of quiet to have an authentic experience of God. This week here at St. Matthew's, we're going to start Thursday morning a time of centering prayer. Meredith Sanderson, who you may know as Max's mom, will be leading this at 7:45 on Thursday mornings. Centering prayer is rooted in our Christian tradition way back into the early days of Christianity, out of the monastic movement. It's a time of intentionally spending time in God's loving presence and with one another in silence and listening to what God maybe has to say to us in that silence. I hope that you'll consider joining us on Thursday mornings as you're able, or finding quiet times in your own life, whether that is just before bed, whether it's in a moment or two by your Advent wreath, or whether it's a moment or two when you first get up, or whatever other quiet moment you can steal during the day, to listen to where God may be leading you in your life this Advent. Keep awake. Be alert. God is calling to us in unexpected ways, in unexpected places, and leading us to do unexpected things. God is helping us to focus on what really matters, inviting us to peel away all the extraneous details that we have put on top of things. God is calling us to life-giving celebrations. And God is calling us to listen for what God is saying to us in the quiet moments of our lives. I pray that by doing this, by listening for where God is leading us, that we may find that this season of Advent, this season of waiting, will be a blessing. Amen.